Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. When I first met Adrian, I promised myself that he would only ever be a friend. He was charming in a way that drew people in, but he also carried a weight in his eyes, a kind of loneliness I recognized too well. We worked together on a project that had us spending long hours in the office, sometimes well past midnight. Those nights blurred into laughter over cold takeout, whispered conversations when the world outside had gone quiet, and a bond that grew stronger than I ever intended. I told myself I was just being kind, just being supportive. After all, I was married. I had lines I swore I would never cross. Adrian never pushed, never asked for more than what I offered, but the unspoken energy between us grew undeniable. Every time his hand brushed mine when passing papers, every time his eyes lingered a little too long when I laughed, my heart betrayed me by racing in a way it hadn't in years. One night, a storm raged outside while we were still at the office. The rain hammered against the windows and thunder echoed like a warning I refused to hear. The power flickered, and Adrian suggested we wait it out instead of driving home in dangerous weather. We sat together in the glow of a desk lamp, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. He asked me about my marriage gently in that patient way he had. I found myself opening up more than I should have about the distance, the silence, the way my husband and I lived more like roommates than lovers. I admitted how lonely I felt, and for the first time in years, someone really listened. When tears stung my eyes, Adrian reached out, brushing them away with his thumb. It was such a small gesture, but it broke something inside me. The dam of restraint I had held for so long cracked wide open. I told myself to pull away, to remember the promises I had made. But when his hand lingered on my cheek and his gaze locked with mine, I leaned in instead. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, but it carried years of suppressed longing. The storm outside roared as though mirroring the chaos within me, but I couldn't stop. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Every nerve in my body burned with the kind of passion I had forgotten existed. Afterwards, silence settled between us, heavy and full of questions neither of us dared to ask. I whispered that this couldn't happen again, that I had crossed a line I swore I never would. Adrian nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he felt the same pull I did. The days that followed were torture. We pretended to be the same as before, professional and composed, but every accidental touch felt electric. Every stolen glance burned hotter than the last. The guilt gnawed at me, but the craving for him only grew. One evening, as I packed up my things, Adrian stopped me at the door. "I know you said this can't happen again," he said quietly, "but I can't pretend I don't feel this. Tell me to walk away and I will, but if you don't..." I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, the weight of choice pressing down on me. Walking away would mean safety, predictability, keeping my world intact. Staying would mean surrendering to a passion that terrified me as much as it thrilled me. And in that moment, I realized the line I thought I would never cross wasn't behind me anymore. It was beneath my feet. The look in Adrian's eyes haunted me long after that night. I told myself it was a mistake, something born of loneliness and a storm that trapped us together. But my body and heart betrayed me with every memory of his touch. I lay beside my husband in bed, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how I had managed to become someone I swore I would never be. I felt both guilt and a strange, dangerous exhilaration that refused to let me go. The office became a battlefield of unspoken words. We sat across from each other in meetings, surrounded by colleagues, but beneath the surface there was a current that pulled at us. His gaze would find mine, lingering for just a second too long, and I would feel my face warm. The world thought nothing of it. We were simply coworkers, teammates, but I knew the truth. Every time I laughed at one of his jokes, every time. He brushed past me in the hallway. The secret between us deepened. It didn't take long before we found ourselves slipping again. It wasn't planned, it never was. One evening, the office emptied out. and we stayed behind to finish some last-minute changes. I told myself I'd leave before it got late, but when Adrian leaned over my desk to show me something on my laptop, his shoulder brushed mine and all my resolve dissolved. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally broke. His lips were on mine again, harder this time, filled with a hunger neither of us could deny. That night, we didn't stop. We crossed every line, knowing exactly what it meant. Afterwards, I sat there breathless, the taste of him still on my lips, torn between shame and the undeniable truth that I didn't regret it. What followed were weeks of stolen moments, carefully disguised as routine. A brush of hands while handing over a document, lingering in the parking lot until the others had gone. Lunches that turned into hours of conversation where we forgot the world around us. We both knew we were living on borrowed time, but it only made everything more intense. The guilt grew heavier. At home, my husband noticed my distance. He'd ask simple questions. How was work? Why are you smiling at your phone? And I'd stumble through lies that left a bitter taste in my mouth. I hated myself for it, yet I couldn't stay away from Adrian. He awakened something in me that had been sleeping for years, something I thought I had lost forever. One weekend, Adrian invited me to his place while his roommate was away. I almost said no, but the ache of wanting him won. When I walked through his door, it was different than the hurried touches and rushed moments we usually shared. He had cooked dinner, lit candles, and for the first time, it felt less like an affair and more like a life we could have had if things were different. We sat on his couch after dinner, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I don't want to be your secret, he said softly. I want more. I didn't know how to answer. My heart screamed yes, but my mind was shackled to the life I had built with someone else. I thought of the years with my husband, the promises we made, the life we had shared. But when Adrian touched my hand, I thought of how alive I felt with him, how real and raw everything was in his presence. It became harder to hide. I started making excuses more often, lying about errands or late-night work calls. I deleted messages, double-checked my phone, and yet there was always the risk of being caught. One night, I forgot to erase a notification, and my husband asked me who Adrian was. My chest tightened, but I laughed it off, saying he was just a coworker who messaged me about deadlines. He nodded, but I could see the shadow of doubt in his eyes. That doubt grew. He started paying more attention to my schedule, asking questions I wasn't prepared for. I knew the ground beneath me was shifting, that the life I was clinging to was close to breaking. Still, I couldn't let go of Adrian. Every time I tried, he pulled me back with the simple truth of how he made me feel. The danger of it all made the affair burn brighter. The risk of being discovered hung over us like a storm cloud, but neither of us stepped away. Every kiss, every embrace felt stolen from a world that wasn't supposed to be ours. And maybe that's what made it impossible to resist. I found myself living in two worlds, one of comfort, predictability, and promises I no longer felt connected. Two, and another of fire, passion, and the terrifying possibility of losing everything. The choice I once thought I would never face had become unavoidable, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before both worlds collided in a way that would change everything forever. Every morning became a test of willpower. I would wake up beside my husband, his hand draped casually over my waist, and pretend that nothing had changed, that I was still the same woman who once looked at him with adoration. But the truth was written in the way I lingered in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, remembering Adrian's touch instead of his dot at work. It became impossible to hide how much Adrian and I gravitated toward each other. We didn't dare let our colleagues suspect, but the energy between us was undeniable. Sometimes in meetings, I would feel his gaze on me, and it made my pulse quicken in ways I couldn't explain. Even when we kept our distance, even when we barely exchanged words, the air between us hummed with electricity. It was dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. One Friday evening, when most of the office had cleared out, I found myself alone with him again. I told myself I would leave right after finishing my report, but when I looked up and saw him leaning against the doorway of my office, Watching me with that quiet intensity, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked over, took the papers from my hand, and set them aside. I should have stopped him. I should have reminded both of us of the line I had already crossed. But when he kissed me, slow and deliberate, I melted into him like I'd been waiting all day for that moment. The affair began to spill into other parts of our lives. He started sending me small notes, little reminders of him that I tucked away like guilty treasures. I would check my phone at night, lying beside my husband, reading Adrian's words under the covers with a racing heart. Sometimes it was simple thinking of you, and other times it was confessions that left me trembling like, I don't sleep well when you're not beside me. I became reckless without meaning to. I started dressing differently for work, paying more attention to how I looked. My husband noticed, asking why I suddenly cared so much about my outfits and makeup. I brushed it off with excuses, but inside I knew it was for Adrian. Everything I did seemed to circle back to him. The guilt grew heavier, and yet so did the pull. I told Adrian we needed to slow down, that I couldn't keep living in two worlds. He listened, nodded, but then he would find me alone again, and all the restraint I thought I had built crumbled the moment his hand touched mine. He didn't pressure me. He didn't have to. My body and my heart betrayed me every time. One night, my husband suggested we go away for a weekend. Just the two of us. I agreed, hoping maybe it would mend the cracks between us. We drove to a quiet seaside town, walked along the shore, and ate dinner by candlelight. On the surface, it was everything a couple should have wanted. But as I sat across from him, listening to his stories, I felt hollow. I smiled, I laughed, I held his hand. But inside, I felt like I was betraying him even more by pretending. When we returned home, Adrian was waiting. Not literally, but he messaged me the moment he knew I would be back. He asked if I had missed him, and the truth was I had, terribly. It struck me then how unfair it all was, not just to my husband, but to myself. I was split in two, torn between duty and desire, between what was safe and what was real. The unraveling quickened after that. My husband grew more suspicious. He started asking about Adrian more directly, about why I always seemed to mention him. I denied everything, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. He wasn't a fool. He knew something had shifted. I tried to convince myself I could manage it, that I could keep both lives balanced without either one colliding into the other. But I knew I was lying. Every secret message, every hidden touch, every night I lay awake thinking of Adrian, it was all leading toward something inevitable. Secrets like ours don't stay buried forever. And yet, even as the walls of my life began to crack, I couldn't bring myself to let Adrian go. Because with him, I felt something I hadn't, in years alive, wanted, seen. And once you taste that kind of passion, it's impossible to return to a life where you feel invisible. The suspicion in my husband's eyes grew sharper with each passing week. I caught him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, as if searching for answers in my face. Sometimes he asked the little questions, where I'd been, why I was late, who I'd been talking to on the phone, but other times it was just silence, the heavy kind that made me feel like he already knew. And maybe in his heart he did. Adrian and I became more careful, but caution only seemed to heighten the urgency. Every glance across the office felt like a secret conversation. Every small brush of his hand against mine set my pulse racing. The risk of being discovered made the fire between us burn brighter. We told ourselves we would stop 100 times, but then we'd find ourselves alone, and all of those promises fell apart. One rainy evening, when my husband was away on yet another trip, Adrian offered to drive me home. The storm had flooded. The streets and traffic crawled, giving us more time than usual. I remember sitting in his car, watching the rain trail down the windows, the world outside blurred and distant, while inside the air was thick with tension. His hand rested on the gear shift, so close to mine that the smallest movement would bring us together. Finally, I gave in and let my fingers brush against his. He turned to look at me, and I saw it in his eyes. He was as lost in me as I was. In him, the rest of the drive felt like we were suspended outside of time. That night, instead of dropping me off, he parked around the corner from my house. We sat there in silence, the storm raging around us, both knowing we should say goodbye. But when he reached over and touched my face, all of my defenses crumbled. The kiss that followed was fierce, almost desperate, as if we were both clinging to something we couldn't afford to lose. When I finally pulled away and stumbled into my house, I felt both exhilarated and sick with guilt. My husband called soon after to check in, and I forced my voice to sound steady, as if nothing at all had happened. The double life began to wear on me. I found myself lying with such ease it frightened me about where I was going, who I was seeing, why I was late. My husband started noticing the changes, the way I lingered over text, the sudden attention I paid to my appearance, the faraway look in my eyes when I thought no one was watching. He didn't accuse me outright, but his questions carried weight. I hated the deception, but not enough to stop. Because with Adrian, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The more we tried to suppress what we felt, the more impossible it became. Adrian started talking about a future, about what life could be like if we didn't have to hide. He never pushed, but his words lingered long after we parted. Late at night, lying beside my husband, I imagined what it would be like to leave everything behind, to choose Adrian openly. The thought thrilled me, but it also terrified me. One afternoon when the office was quiet, Adrian found me alone. He closed the door behind him, leaned against my desk, and said, "I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want pieces of you, I want all of you." His voice shook with sincerity, and for the first time, I saw the depth of what he felt. It wasn't just passion, it was something far more dangerous. It was love. I couldn't answer him. My heart thundered in my chest as I tried to find the right words. I told him I needed time, but even as I said it, I knew time was running out. The more we tried to hide, the more the truth threatened to spill. Every stolen glance, every secret. Meeting, every excuse I fed my husband brought us closer to exposure. And yet, even with the fear pressing in on me, I kept choosing Adrian. Because what we had, however fragile and forbidden, felt more real than anything I had known in years. The weeks blurred together in a haze of secret meetings and stolen moments, and I found myself living in constant contradiction. By day, I was the wife who smiled at dinner, who asked about bills and schedules, who laughed at my husband's predictable jokes. But beneath the surface, I was consumed by Adrian, his words, his touch, the way he made me feel like the world only existed. When he was near, every time I promised myself I'd stop, something happened to undo me. A glance across the office that lingered too long. A text that arrived late at night, simple words that carried unbearable weight. "I miss you." One afternoon he sent me a picture of the lake he had driven past, saying it reminded him of me. I stared at it for far too long, imagining us there, far away from everything that held us apart. The guilt gnawed at me. At home, I caught myself watching my husband, wondering when I had stopped truly seeing him. He was kind in his way, steady, the sort of man who provided stability. But somewhere along the years, our marriage had become a quiet arrangement, more about routines than passion. When I compared the way he brushed past me in the hallway with the way Adrian looked at me, like I was the center of the universe, the contrast was unbearable. The lies grew heavier, but so did the pull. One evening, when my husband had to attend a late meeting, Adrian and I drove out of town under the excuse of a work errand. We ended up at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one knew us. The world felt softer there, like it belonged to us. He held my hand across the table, his thumb brushing lightly over my skin, and for the first time, I felt what it might be like if we weren't hiding, but as soon as I returned home, reality slammed into me. My husband was waiting, not with anger, but with quiet suspicion. He asked why I was late, his voice calm, almost too calm. I gave him a half-baked story about traffic and errands, and though he nodded, his eyes lingered on me in a way that made my heart pound. It was the first time I realized he might already be piecing things together. I should have stopped then. I should have walked away before everything collapsed. But instead, I leaned deeper into Adrian. The secrecy made us bolder weekend escapes disguised as visits to friends, afternoons where we pretended to be tied up at work. Every time we met, I convinced myself it would be the last. But as soon as he touched me, every ounce of resolve vanished. One night, after another stolen evening together, I returned home to find my husband awake, sitting in the dark living room. He didn't speak at first, just looked at me as I fumbled for an excuse. Finally, he said, "I don't know what's happening to us anymore." The sadness in his voice cut deeper than anger ever could. For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything, to confess the truth and release the burden. But the words stuck in my throat, and instead I murmured that I was just tired, that I needed sleep. I lay awake that night, torn apart by guilt and longing. Adrian had asked me earlier if I could ever imagine leaving, and I hadn't answered. The question haunted me. Could I really give up everything I built, my marriage, my home, the life people thought I lived, for a love that existed only in the shadows? Yet even with that fear, the thought of letting Adrian go felt impossible. He had become the place where I felt alive again, where I felt like the woman I used to be before years of routine dulled me into silence. Every smile he gave me, every whisper of my name, every risk we took only drew me deeper in. The balance I had tried so hard to keep was slipping. The walls between the two worlds I lived in were starting to crack, and I could feel the pressure, building with every lie I told, every stolen hour I spent with him. Something was going to give, I just didn't know when, or how devastating the fallout would be. The tension between the life I had and the life I craved grew unbearable. Each morning I woke up beside my husband, I felt the weight of the secret pressing down on me. Every time his hand brushed mine across the breakfast table, I had to swallow the guilt that threatened to spill from me. He asked me simple questions. My plans were for the day, what I wanted for dinner, but underneath, I could feel him studying me. I caught his eyes lingering too long. As though he were trying to read something I was too afraid to say aloud. With Adrian, it was the opposite. There was no silence heavy with suspicion. There was only heat, urgency, and a tenderness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. He knew when I was exhausted, when I was lying to myself, when I just needed someone to listen. He made me feel seen in a way that my marriage hadn't in years. That was the most dangerous part, not the kisses, not the stolen hours, but the way he understood me. One afternoon, after a long meeting, he lingered in my office while everyone else had left. He closed the door, leaned against the wall, and said quietly, "I can't keep pretending this is just nothing." The way his voice cracked unsettled me. I tried to brush it off, telling him we had to be careful, that it wasn't safe, but he stepped forward and took my hands in his. "It's not about being careful," he said. "It's about the fact that I'm in love with you." The words hit me harder than I expected. I'd known in the quiet way we both avoided saying it, but hearing it out loud made everything more real. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, but fear gripped me. My entire life, my marriage, my reputation, my home would change if I admitted it. Instead, I whispered, "We can't talk about this here," and pulled my hands away. But the look in his eyes followed me for days. At home, I noticed my husband watching me more carefully. He asked if I was happy, if work was stressful, if something was wrong between us. I told him no, everything was fine, forcing a smile I didn't feel. He seemed unconvinced, but he didn't press. That silence was worse than confrontation, because I knew it meant he was waiting, gathering evidence, biding his time. The strain seeped into every part of my life. Simple things became complicated, where I placed my phone, how long I lingered outside, what excuses I gave. I began to dread the sound of my husband's voice calling my name, afraid of what question might come next. Yet, at the same time, the fear made me run harder toward Adrian. Every kiss felt like defiance, every whispered word like a rebellion against the life I was trapped in. One evening, when my husband had left for a late dinner with colleagues, Adrian and I drove to a quiet spot on the edge of town. We parked by a stretch of water, the surface shimmering under the moonlight. We sat in silence at first, our hands linked, the night air cool around us. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Tell me the truth. If you could leave everything behind, would you choose me?" The question broke me open. My throat tightened and I couldn't speak. I wanted to say yes, to give him the answer he was begging for, but all I managed was, "I don't know." He let out a shaky laugh, not mocking, but full of pain. "That's the thing," he said. "I already know I'd choose you." Gah. Drive back was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. When I slipped into bed later, my husband stirred beside me and pulled me close, his arm heavy around me. The contrast between his steady warmth and the chaos in my chest left me wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My heart pounding with a truth I couldn't voice. Days turned into weeks, and the line between the two lives I was living grew thinner. My husband became more distant, yet more watchful, while Adrian grew more insistent, urging me to see that what we had was worth the risk. And me, I was caught in the middle, torn between the safety of what I had built and the fire of what I had found. Every glance, every touch, every excuse felt like one step closer to something breaking. I knew the secret couldn't last forever. One day, someone would slip, someone would notice, and the fragile balance I was clinging to would come crashing down. But even knowing that, I couldn't stop, because somewhere deep inside, I knew the truth. I had already crossed the line, and there was no way back.